What is going on, Headliner Nation? Jake, Fantasy Headliners. Hopefully everyone's doing well out there today. We have a motherfucking banger here today where we're talking about which quarterbacks are we going to start and sit for Week 8 fantasy football. Now, we know we have no Patrick Mahomes. We have no Justin Herbert right now because he's on his bye week. We have some injured quarterbacks in Russell Wilson and Ryan Tannehill. We have teams changing quarterbacks like no more Matt Ryan and now Sam Ehlinger. We have a lot of confusion at the quarterback position right now, but we're going to try to give you all the information so you can make the best possible choice for your fantasy lineup here in Week 8, and we're not wasting any damn time. We're getting right in to Thursday Night Football where we have the Baltimore Ravens and Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And on the surface, we should be super pumped, right? We got Lamar Jackson and Tom Brady in primetime football in a Thursday night game, and they're just not playing that well right now. And we'll start off with Lamar Jackson, who's still currently sitting at quarterback 4 overall, but has now had 4 straight quote-unquote down games when you think of Lamar Jackson type production. Anyway, he hasn't had multiple touchdowns in a game now since week 3 and has only thrown for over 200 yards one time in the last month. But we know they aren't going to be throwing a lot, only 28 pass attempts per game, which is 28th in the league. But he also hasn't run for more than 80 yards now in a month either. And that is a problem. If we're not throwing a lot and we're not getting the production in the running game, we got issues. But now he has a matchup going up against Tampa Bay, who has been anything but elite as of late. Their secondary is very banged up. They're allowing 16 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, kind of middle of the road, 17th overall. When it comes to injuries, we know about J.K. Dobbins, but we also know that Rashad Bateman's still not 100%. Mark Andrews not 100% either. But it's like building a house with tools from like the 1800s, right? You have what you need, but you don't really know how to use them. And when you do start to use them, you're a little bit slower at it. That's kind of what I'm looking at when I see the Ravens offense right now. They still have the tools to be successful. They just don't really know what they're doing with them here as of yet. But with Lamar, even though he has limited weapons, the ceiling is too high to ever you start Lamar Jackson. For Tom Brady, he's currently sitting at quarterback 12 overall on the season, but everything just looks off. Right now, his numbers last week would have been a lot better had Mike Evans not dropped that huge touchdown ball, but the team overall just doesn't look focused. He's only had one game all year in which he's had multiple touchdown passes. That's like a WTF stat if I've ever heard one, especially since they're still throwing the ball so much. 42.3 times per game is 3rd highest in the league. Now a matchup going up against Baltimore. They allow the 7th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks at 20.2 per contest. Cameron Brate and Russell Gage have already been ruled out. Julio Jones, Mike Evans, both guards, Shaq Mason and Luke Goedeke, they're questionable or ruled out already as well, along with members of this secondary. This team is in shambles right now. Now, when you look at X Factor and you see the big fat 0 in that column, it's because for me, there isn't one as of right now. A lot of stats and the matchup really makes Tom Brady, on paper, a start, but he is a fringe start for me. At this point, he is a super high risk and he needs Mike Evans to play. If for whatever reason we come to game time and Evans is ruled out, I don't want to start Tom Brady anymore. I need to have at least Mike Evans in this lineup. Even if he's heavily limited, I'm worried as well. There's just a whole lot not going right in Tampa Bay right this second. But now let's kick it over to Sunday football. We got an early game. Remember, we're going to London for the Denver Broncos and Jacksonville Jaguars. We'll start it off with either Brett Rippon or Russell Wilson. I don't really care. We can throw either name at the top of these, and they're pretty much going to be identical. We really don't want either part of them if we're being completely honest. It doesn't matter which one starts here for fantasy football. This offense is nowhere near close enough to actually trust in fantasy lineups right now. They're throwing the ball around 35 times a game, 19th in the league, going up against Jacksonville. They allow the 14th most points against opposing quarterbacks at 18.1, but we know Russell Wilson banged up himself. We know the offensive line missing a few key pieces as well, but this team hasn't scored double-digit points in 2 of their last 3 games played, and they've only scored more than 16 points in a game one time all year. Then you add on top of it, this is a London game. I can't. I'm sorry, I just can't. What about Trevor Lawrence? Now, we have ourselves now top 10 fantasy quarterback, Trevor Lawrence, who's averaging over 17 fantasy points per game. But the crazy thing here is He only has 1 passing touchdown over his last 3 games combined. Luckily, he also has 3 rushing touchdowns over that span, and that's what's really helping him right now. They're throwing the ball right around 35 times a game, 18th in the league. Denver, though, is not a great matchup for Trevor Lawrence. If they're doing anything right in Denver, it's their pass defense. They're only allowing 10.2 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks in fantasy football. That is the fewest in the league, and they're going to be in London. Now, a few minor injuries along the offensive line here, of course, but this is, like I said, the only thing that Denver has been good at is limiting quarterbacks in fantasy football, defending the pass. And Trevor Lawrence hasn't exactly been lighting it up through the air here as of late. We're too dependent on the rushing touchdowns in a very tough matchup. I'm going to sit Trevor Lawrence. But now, let's come back stateside. Let's talk about the Carolina Panthers and Atlanta Falcons. For Carolina, where the hell did that come from, PJ Walker? 177 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in Week 7. Now, is Tampa that bad, or is PJ Walker that good? I mean, don't get me wrong. He had a few great throws, but we're not going to rush to start PJ Walker and the Carolina Panthers offense anytime soon. We know it's going to be a low-volume passing offense, only 22 pass attempts just last week. Atlanta, they allow the second most points to fantasy quarterbacks at 22.3 per game. So the matchup on paper is beautiful. But that's about it, right? No major injury concerns here for PJ Walker. The X factor is, even though we know there's some magic in there, is it enough to want to trust in your fantasy lineups after seeing it only 1 time? For me, it's not. He's currently a sit. His opponent, Marcus Mariota. Has anyone ever ridden the ride Tower of Terror at Disney World? Because that up and down feeling is what it's like to start Marcus Mariota in fantasy football. He has 5 touchdowns over the last 4 games played, but 3 of them were just in 1 game, right? So it's not like he's out there scoring touchdowns each and every week. 3 of the last 4 games he's played, he's failed to even get past 19 pass attempts in a game. Who knows which Carolina Panthers defense is going to show up? Right now on the season, they're only allowing 15.3 fantasy points per game. Even though there's no major injury concerns here for Marcus Mariota, you just never know what to expect. There is no consistency in his play, and that makes him a fantasy sit for me once again. How about the Chicago Bears and the Dallas Cowboys down in Big D? And for Justin Fields, it's alive! It's alive! I mean, that's exactly what we'd love to see from Justin Fields. You're starting to see some of that skill set that we really wanted to see coming into the season that we haven't really had a chance to yet. But what has changed? Why has he all of a sudden gotten better? Well, it's the running game, right? He's had at least 12 rush attempts now in back-to-back games for the first time since week 1. So that rushing upside is what we're looking for here in fantasy football when it comes to Justin Fields, because we know they're not going to throw the ball a lot. Only averaging right around 20 times a game. We need a little bit more volume, but if we can get that rushing upside, that's going to help. That's going to boost it up here just a little bit. But unfortunately, now he gets a matchup going up against the Dallas Cowboys. They allow the 4th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks at only 12 fantasy points per game. We have multiple offensive line injuries here that are kind of leading to that pocket breaking down, which is then in turn leading to scrambling and rushing Justin Fields, so they're not hurting him too much. I love what I've seen here in back-to-back games from Justin Fields, especially what he did against the New England Patriots just last week. He could do that again this week. In a very difficult matchup, I'm not going to write off the Chicago Bears altogether. As you can see, his total right now is at 14. He's 1 point away on the confidence scale from becoming a start. I like what I'm seeing for Justin Fields. Just need to see a skosh. Just a skosh. Just a little bit more, Justin. Just put a little bit more on top, and you may become fantasy viable each week. How about his opponent, Dak Prescott? Dak in his first game back wasn't bad, right? He wasn't bad, but he wasn't great considering he was playing against the Detroit Lions. Now, he had 207 yards and 1 touchdown, but no rushing, and that's just not going to cut it for what we need in fantasy football. That ceiling right there is a little bit too low, especially since they're not throwing the ball that much, right? 30 pass attempts a game, 25th in the league. Chicago really isn't an easy matchup for him either. They're only allowing 14.3 fantasy points per game, 9th fewest in the NFL. Zeke, we know, is banged up though. And if Zeke is limited, we can see more in the passing game from Dak Prescott now in his second game back. feeling a little bit more comfortable could kind of bump up the ceiling a little bit. Everything on paper says this really isn't a great start. And for sure it has risk, right? But Dak at home in his second game back, I feel like he's going to take more deep shots down the field, something that Chicago is a little bit vulnerable to on defense, and we could see a little bit more output from Dak Prescott, so he's going to be a start. What about the Miami Dolphins and Detroit Lions? We'll start it off with Tua. It was great to see Tua back on the football field here just last week, and I said it on Monday, and people questioned me on it when I said that he played well. He exceeded my expectations, and when people see that or they hear that, they just look at box scores and they're like, dude, he didn't absolutely kill it. He didn't play that great. 261 yards passing, 1 touchdown, no interceptions, completed 60% of his passes, scrambling out of the pocket. But what I meant by that is this. He wasn't playing scared. He suffered back-to-back concussions, really whether they want to admit it or not. And the guy came out there, really felt comfortable in the pocket, and didn't let those past injuries affect his decision-making in his first game back. Now, obviously, Tua, you gotta slide. No more head first dives. I get it. You want to be a football player. You want to go for the first down, but bro, you got to protect yourself here just a little bit, and that's what I like to see from Tua. Not everything is just box score related. If he had come out there and put up those same stats and looked timid and shy and scared in the pocket, I would be a lot more concerned going forward. I'm looking long-term here, not just what happened last week, but they're throwing the ball over 36 times a game, 12th most in the NFL. Now they get the Detroit Lions, who got the 4th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks at 21 points per game. The offensive line starting to get a little bit healthier, even though the bulk of their injuries are on defense still. That's okay, because that's going to lead to more points given up, which means Tua's going to have to continue to throw. Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill are almost unstoppable when they're on the field together. And then you add in the likes of Raheem Mostert and Mike Gesicki. Defenses can't contain all of these guys each and every week. The ceiling's going to be high. The floor is going to be safe. In a good matchup, we're not overthinking this one. We're starting Tua here this week, which will then take us down to Jared Goff of the Detroit Lions. He's currently down to quarterback 17 overall, and the pre-bye week struggles kind of continued in week 7. Now, back-to-back games with 0 touchdowns, even though they were difficult matchups, right? He had New England and he had Dallas. But what he really needs is these offensive weapons to stay healthy. They're still throwing the ball 35 times a game. Miami, they allow the 5th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks at 20.5 per game. This is a perfect opportunity for Jared Goff to bounce back. So I'm going to head over to Prize Picks, and I'm going to smash the over on the passing prop for Jared Goff, currently set at 240.5. That's a number I think he can exceed here this year. If you haven't joined us on Prize Picks yet, make sure you do. Use promo code Headliners when you sign up for a new account. We'll match your initial deposit up to $100 and have a lot of fun along the way. Now, the questions for injuries is, does DeAndre Swift return this week? He's back at practice, so that's a good sign. It sounds like Amon-Ra, the Sun God, he should be back and good to go this week as well. But once again, I expect Detroit to be trailing in this game and having to throw the ball a lot. Given the fact that the Miami secondary is pretty beat up, I'm looking for Goff to go out there and throw the ball quite a bit here this week, and he's going to be a start for me, which will then take us down to Arizona and the Minnesota Vikings. We'll start off with Kyler Murray, currently sitting at quarterback 6, and despite not having huge games, he's still scored at least 16 fantasy points in 4 straight ball games, and now that he has DeAndre Hopkins back, that's going to help extend more drives. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of 3-and-outs early in the season for the Arizona Cardinals. They needed somebody to really be that possession-type guy to help them get a first down on 3rd and short, 3rd and long. That's where DeAndre Hopkins steps in and really allows them to extend drives and give Kyler more scoring opportunities. They're still one of the highest passing teams in all of football, averaging over 40 attempts per game. Minnesota allows right around 18.6 fantasy points per contest to quarterbacks. That ranks 12th most in the league. The offensive line still dealing with some injuries here in Arizona. Rodney Hudson, Max Garcia, Justin Pugh, just to name a few. Plus, we know we still don't have Hollywood Brown, and we're unclear about James Conner at the time of this recording, but Even though I don't love this being a road game against a team coming off of a bye week, an explosive Minnesota offense can come out and score on this team in Arizona, which is then in turn going to mean that Kyler Murray has to throw for all 4 quarters, going to bump up that floor. So give me Kyler Murray as a start. What about his opponent, Kirk Cousins? He's currently quarterback 14 overall, fresh, right? He's good to go coming off the bye week. He's feeling good. He's historically done very well against the Arizona Cardinals, averaging 260 yards and 2 touchdowns a game against them in his career. And it's kind of what we just expect to see from him every week, right? We can almost every week pencil in Kirk Cousins for right around 250 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, and probably an interception. That's kind of what we come to expect. And that safe floor is why we like him so much. But he's another team that, on the verge of throwing 40 times a game. Going up against Arizona, they allow the 6th most fantasy points to quarterbacks at 20.3 per contest. No major injuries here. Like I said, coming off the bye week, they had an opportunity to get some of those nagging injuries fixed. And then the X factor is what we saw could happen against this secondary just in the second half of last week's ball game. Don't forget, that defense came out on fire against the New Orleans Saints last week, had 2 pick sixes. They were looking like they were going to steamroll it. And then Andy Dalton came out and looked like Joe freaking Montana in the second half against that same defense. It's a defense that can be had, and with the weapons they have in Minnesota, I have no issue starting Kirk Cousins. What about the Las Vegas Raiders and New Orleans Saints for Derek Carr? He's all the way down to quarterback 19. It's not that he's playing overly bad. It's just that they're running so much and so successfully with Josh Jacobs, they're throwing the ball a lot less. In the first 3 games of this season, they were averaging 40 pass attempts per game. Over the last 3, only 30 pass attempts per game. Now, you may be thinking, Jake, it's only 10 pass attempts a game. That's 25% drop off. That is a huge drop off from week to week. So maybe you're not a mathematician, but if you started off averaging 40 and now you're averaging 30, that's going to make your overall season average what? Yes, class, you're correct. 35 pass attempts per game. Now going up against the New Orleans Saints, who allow 18.2 fantasy points per game, 13th most. Darren Waller, still questionable for this offense. Has to be a little bit lower in the X Factor category for me, though, just because of how well Josh Jacobs is playing. They're not overly reliant on Derek Carr having to throw the ball 40 times a game for 400 yards and 3 touchdowns just to have a chance to win. That's how good Josh Jacobs is playing. But on an offense that still has Devontae Adams, still going to be a little bit of an X factor there. How about his opponent, Andy Dalton? And honestly, as of right now, it's still a little unclear whether it's going to be Dalton or Winston. As of right now, it's looking like it's going to be Dalton, but I'm not overly confident in either one of them. Dalton's garbage points is what really helped him last week. It was his first game with multiple touchdowns on the season, but they are throwing the ball 36 times a game. But here's what I love. This is not a difficult matchup whatsoever. The Las Vegas Raiders allow the most fantasy points of any team in the NFL to opposing quarterbacks at 24.4 per game. Of course, we would love to have Michael Thomas and Jarvis Landry back in this offense. How about offensive guard Andrews Pete? That's definitely a piece we need back on the offensive line as well. If this wasn't a home game, I wouldn't be considering it. But with a home game in which Andy Dalton plays a lot better, the entire Saints team plays better at home in a great matchup, he's going to be a very, very low-end, high-risk start for me here this week. What about New England and the New York Jets? You got Mac Jones, you got Bailey Zappi. No idea who it's going to be, but honestly, I feel the same about both of these guys. Doesn't really matter to me here which one starts the game. But it's not all just because of the quarterback play. It's because of the matchup going up against the Jets. The Jets right now are only allowing 14.7 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, and they're playing really well. Plus, we're dealing with some offensive line injuries here in New England with guys like David Andrews and Isaiah Wynn. Plus, a quarterback carousel, right? How do we not know that, hey, Mac Jones is going to be the starter, and if he struggles again, then Bailey Zappi comes in, and then maybe Bailey Zappi gets hurt, and then we have Mac Jones. That is just not something I want to deal with in fantasy football right now, so no matter who starts, they're going to be a sit. For Zach Wilson, how does this offense change now without Breece Hall? Do they start to throw the ball maybe a little bit more because they haven't been throwing it much? Wilson hasn't had more than 26 pass attempts in a game since week 4 and hasn't had a passing touchdown since then either. Yet, hasn't lost a game as a starter. It's all the running game and the defense right now for the Jets. Now, New England was just torched by Justin Fields last week, but on the season, allowing 18 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, 15th in the NFL. Now, obviously, we know we lost Breece Hall, but Elijah Vera Tucker on the offensive line is a huge loss. This was already a team dealing with multiple high-end losses on the offensive line. Now to lose AVT to IR, that is no bueno right there. Corey Davis also still questionable. There's just not enough opportunity for me here right now. And plus, like I said, that loss of Elijah Vera Tucker could lead to Zach Wilson running for his life more times than not and really limiting the opportunities he has in the passing game. So he's going to remain a sit as well. How about the Pittsburgh Steelers and Philadelphia Eagles? We'll start with Kenny Pickett. And yes, that's what I called him. That's what I'm going to continue to call him, because people can continue to make up whatever excuses they want for Kenny Pickett and the Pittsburgh Steelers, but facts are facts. And he has thrown 7 interceptions. I don't care whose fault they were. I don't care if they were drops or the stat column says he has 7 interceptions. And in fantasy football, that matters because he only has 2 touchdowns as well through the air. Now that's just not going to cut it here in fantasy football. Now, I'm not sitting here saying this kid sucks. I'm not saying that. But when it comes to fantasy football, it's just not time to start him yet, even though they're throwing the ball 36 times a game. Now he's going up against Philadelphia, coming off their bye week. They only allow 11.5 fantasy points per game, second fewest in the league to quarterbacks. Even though there's no major injuries affecting Kenny Pickett, this is just not the time to start. Too many turnovers, not enough touchdowns, and a bad matchup. Can't do it. His opponent, Jalen Hurts. Yep, I will go ahead and start Jalen Hurts off of his bye week. Currently quarterback 5 overall in the season, has 12 total touchdowns, and has had an extra week to prep for this game. Another team, though, not throwing the ball a ton, averaging right around 30 attempts a game, but his rushing upside is going to bump up his potential volume that he could see each and every week. Now a matchup going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers. They allow the 9th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks at 20 fantasy points per game. Now we're still sitting back and waiting to see if we get offensive tackle Lane Johnson back here. Would be a big boost to that offensive line in Philadelphia. Now, not having to throw 2 touchdowns a week is great, considering this is a guy that will continue to score points with his legs. He's had rushing touchdowns in 4 of the 6 games played. You're obviously starting Jalen Hurts. How about the Tennessee Titans and Houston Texans? Now, we'll start off with Houston and Ryan Tannehill. Is it going to be Tannehill? Is it going to be Malik Willis? Will Tannehill be ready in time off of an ankle injury? Kind of waiting to see. Now, I think we know that we wouldn't start, Malik Willis anyway, but we're not going to start Ryan Tannehill either. He just can't catch a break. Either his weapons are hurt or he's hurt. He's got 7 touchdowns in 6 games played, but he hasn't thrown for over 200 yards in a game since week 3. They're only throwing the ball right around 25 times a game. And maybe you see on paper, oh man, they're going against the Texans though. You got to get that out of your mind, because if Houston is doing anything great this year, it's defending the passing game. They're borderline elite right now, allowing only 13.7 fantasy points per game, 7th fewest in the league. Tanny himself being questionable could lead to another one of those New England situations where maybe they go back and forth between quarterbacks. Maybe Ryan Tannehill goes out there, plays a series or 2, realizes he can't make it, and then has to come out of the game. We're not going to risk it with Ryan Tannehill this week. For Davis Mills, finally, right? Good things happen with Davis Mills when he throws the ball over 40 times a game. It was his first 300-yard passing game of the year and has now had at least 2 touchdowns in 2 of his last 3 games played on the season, averaging right around 34 pass attempts a game, going up against Tennessee, who allows the 8th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks at 20.2 per contest. I'm actually going over to Prize Picks again. I'm going to smash the over on Davis Mills of 225.5. Now, obviously, there's some offensive line issues here, but the main injury we're paying attention to is Nico Collins and his groin injury. Is he going to be active and available here this weekend? He really needs that to get that boost in a ceiling for Davis Mills, but there really hasn't been a time all year where I felt comfortable starting Davis Mills. Right now, as I sit here, I still don't feel overly comfortable, but in a bye week scenario, maybe in a 2-quarterback league, a low-end start for me here, a bye week fill-in this week. How about the Washington Commandos and Indianapolis Colts? We got two teams with backup quarterbacks, right? We got Taylor Heinicke of the Washington Commandos, who had a solid first start, 201 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception, and a win against the Green Bay Packers. Had no issues pushing the ball down the field to Terry McLaurin. Had 33 pass attempts in that game last week, which is not bad, but now he's going up against the Colts, who haven't been bad against opposing quarterbacks this year, allowing only 15.3 fantasy points per game. Logan Thomas, Jahan Dotson, Dyami Brown, all 3 pass catchers are still questionable to play this weekend. Would love to get at least one of those pieces back. I love Terry McLaurin. I like Curtis Samuel. I like Antonio Gibson. I like Brian Robinson. But if we can get one more piece, that's really going to help boost the potential floor of Taylor Heinicke. In order for me to start him here, though, I need to hear that there's more weapons active. At the time of this recording, they're not 100% sure to play, so I have him in the sit column, even though I love this kid. I love Taylor Heinicke and watching him play football. His opponent, Sam Ehlinger. Whole lot of unexpected here, right? I mean, this move is overly puzzling to me. I talked about it in my running back video. I mean, at least it's a home game for him. I don't understand this move. Sure, if Matt Ryan was hurt and unable to play, you don't have a choice. But to come out and say that he's going to be the starter for the rest of the year after all the money and what they traded to get Matt Ryan, that makes no sense unless they realize that Matt Ryan really doesn't have a whole lot left, isn't going to be the future, and instead of continually going through veteran quarterbacks and having them leave or retire, let's just tank and try to find a kid to be our franchise quarterback. Let's see what we have in Sam Ehlinger and make our decisions from there. But now he's going up against Washington. They allow almost 19 fantasy points per game, 11th most in the NFL. No major injuries of concern here affecting Sam. But I have to think that this offense is going to change drastically. Maybe that's a good thing for Jonathan Taylor owners, that maybe we start seeing a lot more of these running backs here in the foreseeable future, because I really don't understand what the Colts are doing overall. Why they're benching Matt Ryan. Okay, so he's not the future, but he still gives you the best chance to win right now. Do you not want to win right now? Hashtag tanking in Indianapolis. All right, let's move on to the San Francisco 49ers and Los Angeles Rams. We'll start off with Jimmy G here, who's averaging over 15 fantasy points per game, top 20 at the position, and now has 2 passing touchdowns in 3 straight games. Plus, he's also coming off his first 300-yard passing game of the season, and they more than likely get a full-go CMC here this week after being in town for like 8 days, right? So they're starting to throw the ball a little bit more in San Francisco. We love to see that. He's averaging 39 pass attempts over his last 2 games. Prior to that, he hadn't gone over 30 in his 4 games played. Now, it's not an ideal matchup going up against the Rams. They only allow 14 fantasy points per game, and they're coming off their bye week as well. But most of these injuries are on defense, right? And that's just going to lead to Jimmy G having to throw the ball a little bit more. The one injury we're paying attention to, Deebo Samuel. He's questionable to play. I believe he does, but we'll follow up with the doc on Friday to see if we get any more information. Now, these two teams just faced off in week 4. In that ball game, Jimmy G went for 239 and a touchdown, no interceptions, and won. Now has CMC, George Kittle, hopefully Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk. I mean, that gives him weekly options. Even if they don't have Deebo this week, there's still plenty of opportunity in this offense to boost that floor for Jimmy G, making him somewhat safe in a low-end start. For Matthew Stafford, he's still sitting at quarterback 25 overall, and I'm really hoping that they figured some things out during their bye week, because he hasn't had multiple touchdowns in a game now since week 2. And you know they're still going to throw the ball a lot in LA. It's what their offense is predicated on. 38 times a ball game. I don't mind that whatsoever. Now going up against San Francisco, who is pretty banged up on defense here as of late, but is still only allowing 14.3 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. So that number is starting to climb here a little bit. When it comes to injuries, I'm really waiting for Van Jefferson. And a lot of people may think, why do you think Van Jefferson is like the key? I really feel that Van Jefferson is what's going to be needed in this offense to kind of take the next step up. Van Jefferson was heavily relied upon last year and didn't get near the credit for it because everybody wanted to talk about Cooper Kupp or Odell Beckham, but Van Jefferson was kind of like the forgotten man in that offense that really produced a lot of big plays for them. Now, Matthew Stafford could go out and put up 30 points this game, but this offense has just looked so bad for so many weeks that he's really become a guy that you only have to start him if you have no better options, right? No better choices. More of a very low-end start for me. You can see he scored 15 points. I'm not overly confident in him here this week. How about the New York Giants, Seattle Seahawks, and Daniel Jones? Damn it. Have we gotten to a point where I have to say to start Daniel Jones? I think we have. I mean, he's quarterback 9 on the year, has had multiple touchdowns now in 3 of his last 4 games played, and coming off his first 100-yard rushing game of the season. But he's barely throwing the ball 27 times a game, which is 29th in the league. Going up against Seattle, though, is a good matchup. They allowed 19 fantasy points per game, which is 10th most in the NFL, but he's now also without Daniel Bellinger, his rookie tight end, and Evan Neal on the offensive line. Also, we know that we can never really count on Kadarius Toney or Kenny Golladay anytime soon. They're like perma-questionable at this point, but it has to do with the rushing upside. It has to be there. If Daniel Jones doesn't run, doesn't score rushing touchdowns, we are in trouble, people. That's what I'm telling you. So run, Danny, run. Don't let me down, Daniel Jones, because it's the first time I've started you here this season. All right, how about Geno Smith? Now, Geno, still sitting at quarterback 7 overall on the year, but just lost his number 1 overall wide receiver in DK Metcalf, but that's okay. He said, piss on it. I'm throwing the ball down the field to Marquise Goodwin anyway. Geno Smith now has 2 touchdowns at least in 5 of the 7 games this season and is completing 70% of his passes. Only throwing the ball right around 31 times a game, and then really letting Kenneth Walker just do work out there on the field. The Giants, they're middle of the pack against opposing quarterbacks, allowing just over 15 fantasy points per game. I mentioned the loss of DK, but we're also waiting to see if we get Gabe Jackson back on the offensive line. That would be a big help as well. Geno at home has had at least 2 touchdowns in every game. He's still not a sexy start, but dang, we got to give this guy more credit. He's playing so well, he remains a start for me. Which will then take us down to Sunday Night Football. The Green Bay Packers and Buffalo Bills. We'll start off with Aaron Rodgers, and things aren't looking great in Green Bay, right? Aaron Rodgers continues to be okay, but the team overall is struggling. He's had at least 2 touchdowns in 5 of his last 6 games played, throwing the ball right around 36 times a contest, but now gets a matchup going up against the Buffalo Bills, who allow the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, and they're coming off of a bye week. Christian Watson, Allen Lazard, offensive lineman David Bakhtiari, they're all questionable to play, and now Aaron Rodgers is coming out and saying that there's so many players making mistakes that maybe we need to give some opportunities to some other guys who aren't playing as much. If that isn't directly thrown at Romeo Doubs, I have no idea what is. This is not a good overall situation. Obviously, in a difficult matchup, I'm going to look elsewhere right now and sit Aaron Rodgers. For Josh Allen, you want to know how many points Josh Allen has scored? He's scored so many points that he is still the quarterback 1 overall, despite already having his bye week. That is impressive. Dude has 19 touchdowns in 6 games played, throwing the ball over 40 times a game. Going up against Green Bay, they're pretty solid against quarterbacks, though, allowing only 11.9 fantasy points per game, but no major injuries. And it's Josh Allen in prime time against the Green Bay Packers, and you never sit this guy. What about we go to Monday Night Football, though, where we got the Cincinnati Bengals and Cleveland Browns, and we'll start off with Joe Burrow. That's right, Joe Burrow all the way up to quarterback 3 on the season and is only 5 points away from being the number 1 overall quarterback ahead of Josh Allen. I mean, he's had 4 touchdowns now in back-to-back games, and the offense is absolutely humming, throwing the ball just under 40 times a contest. Cleveland allowing over 15 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. No major injuries of concern for Joe Burrow. And at some point, though, they need to get the running game going. So I dropped the X factor down just a little bit, and this game could be the perfect opportunity to get Joe Mixon back on track. If that's the case, we may see a little bit more of a limited ceiling from Joe Burrow, but not enough to sit him. He's definitely a start. And then for his opponent, Jacoby Brissett, this sounds nuts to say, but Jacoby Brissett is a top 20 fantasy quarterback, even though it doesn't feel like it. Does that mean that he's fantasy startable? Nope, it's not. He's only had 2 touchdowns over his last 3 games combined, throwing the ball only 33 times a game, which is 21st in the league. Now, Cincinnati, they are pretty dang good on defense, allowing only 12.2 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. We have multiple offensive line injuries that we're paying attention to, with Wyatt Teller and Joe Haeg there in Cleveland. But this is all about Joe Burrow in primetime football. I'm sorry, Jacoby Brissett. You're not playing bad, but you're not playing good enough to start. Joe Burrow is the guy that I'm starting here in this contest this week. But there you have it, my starts and sits for the quarterback position here in Week 8 fantasy football. Hopefully I was able to give you some information to maybe make a few of your decisions a little bit easier. Maybe you have multiple guys to choose from. Don't worry, the rankings will be out tomorrow before Thursday Night Football, so make sure you tune into those. But for now, I'm going to get out of here for the day. Do me a favor, hit the like button before you leave. I greatly appreciate that support. Hopefully you guys have a great rest of your day, a great week, and we'll talk to you later.